Thank you. Well, after hearing Chris Coyer speak, it's kind of like, what's the point? We might as well go home, right? I mean, that was pretty good. And I thank you for coming here instead of just going back upstairs and napping till lunchtime. So this is a talk about user experience, how users interact with websites. Everyone who works on websites should understand user experience and think about how your users interact with your website. Whether you're a developer, designer, product manager, or whatever, user experience is still important. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of tips on how to create a better user experience. I already posted a link to the slides on Twitter, so don't worry about writing everything down. You can find me on Twitter, Clarissa, 1 R, 2 S's, and yes, you had to get on there really early to get your first name. I have about 50 different tips to share with you, so we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. First, understand that your users are not you. This is you in an office, sitting in front of a computer, writing code, a big monitor, but you have to remember that although as a developer it's easy to think of the site in terms of you, your users are not like you. They have different goals, they want different things, they have different abilities and different knowledge. So that means that you need to find out who your users are. And this is a whole big field, going into research on users before you create a website. But as a developer, that's still something you should think about a bit, even if there's not a research budget or you're not involved in that process. Think about who your customers are, not just their demographics, but what are the different reasons they might be coming to your site. It's not always straightforward. What are they trying to accomplish? One of the most important things to do on a website is to make users not be frustrated. And the first thing that's easily frustrating users when they come to a website is when they don't know what the website is for. You need to explain that right away when the user gets there if it's not obvious. If you have a site that's something like a Joe's Plumbing, that's pretty obvious. But Airbnb, especially when it first came out, nobody knew what this is. But they explain it right here on the front page. It says, rent unique places to stay from local hosts in 190 plus countries. And if that's not enough, right below that, there's a link to how it works. So if your first feeling on seeing this site is confusion, you can get that worked out right away and you're not going to be frustrated. Second tip is define the user flow through the website. And that means all the steps a user is going to take in an interaction on the site in which they're trying to accomplish something. So it might be on an e-commerce site, for example, they're trying to buy something. But there's other paths they might need to take. What if somebody's coming to the site to find out where their local store is and what time it opens? Or they're coming to the site to make, they need to return something. So all of these things that they're trying to accomplish, think of the different steps that they'll need to take to get to that step from when they start out on the site until when they've completed it. And it's not always the obvious things, and that's why writing it all out can help. For example, buying something, the checkout, that's kind of straightforward, but what happens after the checkout? Your confirmation message, what happens after that? They're looking for a tracking number. What happens after that? What did they do if their package didn't show up when it was supposed to? So once you start writing it down and spending some time thinking about all the different directions a path can take, that'll help you figure out what needs to be there so you're not missing anything. The WordPress.com site has a really good user flow. They have a call to action right on the front page, get started. That's what they want you to do, to press that get started button and sign up for a site. Right next to it says see plans if you need a little more information, but they really want you just clicking on that button and going forward. And they tell you what the steps are, so you're not wondering how long it will take or what's going to happen. It says step 1 of 5 right at the top, so it's pretty straightforward. What kind of site do you need? And they give you some options: blog, website, portfolio, online store, and that'll help them guide you through the rest of the steps. Step 2, choose the theme. And this is a really cool thing they do. They tell you right below that, no need to overthink it. You can always switch to a different theme later. Doing something like that is really important anytime you're asking a user to make a decision that they're going to feel is an important decision, because they're going to be afraid that if they make the wrong decision, they can never go back and fix it. But you're telling them right here, don't worry, just pick something. You can always change it later if you feel like you made the wrong choice. They only give you 9 choices. Obviously, there's a lot more than 9 WordPress themes, but for a new user, they don't want to confuse you too much right away. The next step, they help you choose an address for your site by entering a site name or words that describe the site, and then they give you options. So it continues on in a couple more steps. They have a total of 5. It's pretty simple, and they obviously put a lot of time into what the user flow is and then made sure that they inform the user what's going to be happening and help move them smoothly through this flow. Next tip, make processes simpler. This is something that's really cool. Website Geico, it's a car insurance company in the United States. Like pretty much any website, you create a login, you have your username and your password, and you can never remember what they are. You go to the site and you need to pay your bill. Well, it turns out you don't even need your username and password. At the bottom, they have something called Express Services, where you can do a few different things. If you want to pay your bill, you go to this page, and you enter your phone number or your email address, along with your zip code, and then you can pay your bill. No need for your account number, no need for your password. And this is great because they've taken away this barrier that's going to, make somebody have to go hunting for their piece of paper where they wrote down their password or something like that. There's not a security issue here because you're not logging in and getting information. All you're doing is sending money to the company. And if really somebody wants to log in on your behalf and pay your bill, you're not going to complain about it anyway, right? So no biggie there. Next tip, don't ignore conventions. Conventions are important in everything around us in the world because they just make things easier. Like it's conventional that a house is a rectangle, basically, or some form of that. Houses aren't round because it makes things a lot more difficult. They're harder to build because materials aren't standard. They're harder to live in because have you ever tried to put your IKEA bookshelf against a round wall? It does not work. So in some cases, conventions are good. And there's times when you want to go around conventions, but you need to think about the reasons why you're doing that. For example, on websites, we have conventions like the top left is where the logo goes, and you click that to get to the home page. The navigation's usually at the top. The shopping cart or the sign-in usually at the top right. Those things don't have to be in those locations, but if you're going to put them in a different location, there's a risk that you're going to confuse people. So you need to do some research on that and make sure that you're really making the best decision there. Don't just ignore conventions just to make your site interesting, because the interesting site that's not usable is a site that users aren't going to want to go to. Next, avoid overlays. This is a site that I got to. I was Googling to try to find some more user experience tips to add to this slideshow, and this was a link to an article about user experience. I clicked it, I got to this site. The first thing he asked me to do is to follow him on Facebook to get UX tips, and I've never been to this site before. Why am I going to follow this strange guy on Facebook? I know nothing about him. So I'm annoyed, I click the X, and I get another one behind that. I haven't even gotten to the site yet. Now he wants me to sign up for an email list. I gave up. I didn't even make it to the site. I'm like, this is dumb, and I went away. And that's what users do. If you put too much work in front of them, if you make them work to get to your site, they're not all going to want to do that work. Even if it's something that's really important to you, this is really common on sites to have like an email sign up or something the first thing when you get there. Even if it's really important to you as a company and you think that's going to help you get more email signups, is it worth it if it might potentially be getting people, making people go away and not actually coming to your site? And you kind of have to put some thought into it and do some testing and figure out whether it's worth the trade-off. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But don't just put that overlay there just because you can. Next tip is content strategy. So content is important because that's really what users are coming to your site for, to read your content, to interact with the content on your site. So content strategy is basically the idea of planning your content, developing your content, managing your content once it's already on your site. And by putting some effort and thought into this process, rather than just throwing everything on there willy-nilly, you're going to end up with a much better and more usable website. If you're not doing this, you're going to end up with too much information on your site, which makes things hard to find. You'll have outdated information. There'll be issues with consistency. There'll be issues with repetition, the same thing in multiple places. So that's why this is an actual whole field of people doing this type of work. And if there's not a content strategist on your team, make sure that somebody else is putting some thought into this, because it's so easy to build a beautiful site that's easy to use, and then all of a sudden you fill it with all this content that's kind of worthless, and it just ruins the entire site. A few more things about content. Use plain language. This is important because the average reading level of adults in the United States is about grade 8 or grade 9 level. In Canada, they measure it about differently. And what it comes to is 42% of adults in Canada don't have the reading level necessary for basic tasks, like paying bills, that sort of thing. 42%. And all of you probably had a chance to get a good education. You probably took advantage of it. You're in a pretty, a job that requires a lot of thought. So I think you all probably read and write pretty well. So you need to put this in your head and remember that not everybody can read as well as you can. So try to use clearer, more straightforward language. It doesn't just mean use short words. It means don't use a long, complicated word when a short word means the same thing, right? And this doesn't just benefit people who have lower literacy skills. It also benefits, for example, people who this is not their first language, which might be immigrants. It might also be tourists. If somebody's coming from another country and they want to go to your restaurant or your hotel, if they can't read your website, that's going to kind of turn them away. Plain language actually benefits all users, not just the ones with low literacy or low English skills. For everybody else, if the language on the site is clearer and easier to read, it means it's going to take them less time to interact with the content and get them through the site faster and get them to their goal faster. Next, split up long paragraphs. If users see a big wall of words like this, they're going to be very discouraged by it. It looks like it's going to be hard to read, even if it isn't. Short paragraphs make text seem easier to read. So it's a really easy and straightforward thing you can do. When you see a big, huge paragraph like this, just break it up into a bunch of smaller paragraphs. That helps readers keep their place as they're going through the page also. Long paragraphs like this can almost always be broken up. So just find the place where it works and do it. Increase font size. A lot of sites have text that's too small. If you're younger, you might not know this, but at about around age 40, people start having trouble with their near vision. And I'm over 40, so that's something that I do. I've noticed things that are close are getting harder to read sometimes. I always go to websites and I do Command+ to make the text bigger when it's too small, which is great, but most people don't even know that you can do that. So they're just stuck with the small text. So start out with text that's a good size that's easy to read. And there's a standard for this. In CSS, just start with 1M as your standard text size for paragraphs and body text like that, which is about 16 pixels. Sometimes it can be bigger, especially if you have a large screen when you're doing responsive design. Make the text a bit bigger if there's space for it. You also want to allow adequate line height, which is the space between the lines. Here you can see that there's space between each line of text in the paragraph. That makes it easier to read. It's easier for the user's eyes to go from one line to the next line. A good standard here is doing a line height in CSS of 1.4. And that's not always the right number. That is about 4/10 of a line between the lines of text. It's not always the right number, but it's a good place to start. And usually the right number will be somewhere around there. If you have a line height of 1, which is no spaces between the lines at all, that's definitely too close together. Compared to this, that's no space between the lines. And you can just see by looking at it, it looks like it's harder to read. Make sure that your site has enough white space. White space is important from a design perspective. It keeps the site from looking cluttered, but it also draws attention to the headings and the content as the user goes through the site. More space is needed on a large screen, but you still need some white space on a small screen, just less of it. You want to make sure the pages are easy to scan, because users don't just go to a web page and read from top to bottom. They scroll through it and look for the parts that sound interesting to them. So they're going to look for headings and things like that. So as they're going through a page like this, it's easy to see the headings. They're short, they use keywords, they catch your eye, and it's easy to find the things you want on the page. On the small screen, it's even more important because the user can't see all the content at once. They're going to do a lot of scrolling, and you want to make it as easy as possible for them to get to the right place on the page that has what they want to read. You want to use lists wherever possible, and that's ordered lists with numbers or unordered lists with bullets. Here they just have a paragraph that's one link after another, which is nearly impossible to browse through. Lists don't always have to have bullets. Here in the middle under admission, that's actually, in HTML, that's actually an unordered list, and they just style it to not have bullets to align the different parts of it left and right and put the periods between them. So by having the list in HTML, even though you could do this any old way and style it, by having the list in HTML, you're also making it more accessible for people using screen readers and assistive technology and that sort of thing. Lists don't have to just be going up and down. You can have an ordered list like this where it goes across, and you have little headings and then paragraphs below them for each list item. This is a list also in HTML, so it's just the heading and then more links below it for each of the list items with a little icon next to them. This is not a good list. It's bullets, yes, so that's going in the right direction, but there's so much text behind each bullet that you just don't have the ability to scan them. They should have headings on each bullet to say what's in each bullet, like this does here. Makes it a lot easier to scan through the list. Don't forget microcontent on your site. And microcontent are small groups of words like headings, links, form labels, navigation items, error messages even. And as developers, you might end up getting to write some of the microcontent even though everything else on the site is designed and written. Like error messages, for example. Most teams, the designers, it doesn't even occur to them they need to write an error message. It's just something that you have that comes up in JavaScript or whatever. So don't just plunk any old text in there. The text of the error message is actually something that's very important. You need to make sure that you're letting the user know what's actually going on and making sure they understand what they did wrong. Have a helpful page not found error page. So we call this a 404 error because that's the error that comes back from the server. And a lot of sites just use the default server message like this. To normal people, this is really confusing because they don't know what 404 means, and it's just confusing. So always make sure to add a 404 error page to your site so that you get something that actually makes sense to normal users. This one is pretty good. It's straightforward. It just says this page is not available. Sometimes you can add a link back to the home page or something like that if you think it'll be helpful. The error page is also a good way to introduce a little humor into your site. For Facebook, they have the thumbs up, but the thumb is broken. It has a little bandage on it. It's kind of cute. And you'll see if you look at 404 error pages on different websites, a lot of them do kind of like funny things like this. Next tip is think about devices. And I'm sure you know that users these days have all sorts of different devices, different screen sizes, different input methods like mouse or keyboard or touch or voice, different capabilities. But the thing is that users, it's not just a user's using one device or another device. Most users use multiple devices. They switch between one while they're at work, and then later on they're looking at something on their phone, and they expect things to be the same. Like if you're out at a store and looking for pricing information on something, and then you go home to your desktop and want to buy that same item on the same site, if you go to it and it looks totally different, you're going to be really confused. Some users even use multiple devices at the same time. So it's important to make sure there's consistency between all the different views that your site can provide, whether it's doing responsive design. If you have a separate mobile site, you still need to have consistency in there because users are going to think of it as the exact same site, and they want it to not look exactly the same, but look similar and work in the same manner. And of course, make your site responsive. This is pretty obvious, and I think everybody now knows what responsive design is. But just in case you don't, it's where you have one design, one code set, but it changes based on the side of the screen. So if you make the site wider, everything expands to fill the screen. The navigation might change. You might go from one column to two columns. Things move around on the page. And the goal is to present the best possible website to all users on different devices. So it's going to look a bit different because you want to adapt to their device. But like we just said with consistency, they should still be getting the same experience. If you've done responsive design, you should know that you can't just think of responsive design as designing for phone, tablet, and desktop because there's so many different sizes of devices now. These are both phones, and one is twice as big as the other practically. So you need to make sure that your site looks good for every screen size, not just a few popular sizes. Make sure the touch targets are large enough on your screen. And a touch target is anything where the user is going to tap at the screen, like a link or a button or something like that. It needs to be big enough so a user can hit it easily, but avoid hitting surrounding elements. Like if you're clicking one navigation item, you don't accidentally want to tap on the next navigation item because they're too close together. There's a standard for this, which is 9 millimeters square, which is about 48 pixels. And the standard, it varies depending on who you ask, but that's a good place to start. They've done research on what really works well for this. It's also handy to have white space around any link or tappable item on the screen to reduce the risk of hitting the wrong thing. So that's another place where line height is important, because if you have links in the text, by adding the extra space between the lines, it makes it harder for the user to accidentally click on a link on the next line down or up. You need to know that users have different abilities, and this is really important. We're going to talk about accessibility for a bit. Here we have a user with a vision disability using a smartphone. And people use devices in all sorts of different ways that you might not be familiar with. And there's a lot of different kinds of disabilities too. There's vision, hearing, people who are mobility impaired, people with cognitive disabilities like dyslexia. You want to make sure as many people as possible can access and use all of the features on your site. So I'm going to go over a few specific things you can do. And first, I'd like you to learn how a screen reader works. And there's a lot of videos online where you can see somebody actually using a screen reader. So if you've never done that, look for one of those videos. I don't have time to show you because it's going to be lengthy. A screen reader is basically software that you add onto your computer that helps a user with a disability interact with the other software on the computer. So for example, a screen reader will read text out loud to somebody who's blind or visually impaired and not able to see the screen. And there's a bunch of things you need to do to make sure that your site works on screen readers. And the first is to include alt text. And you've all seen alt text in HTML, but a lot of people do it wrong. I was looking for websites yesterday. I was looking for an example of a site that did it well, and I had trouble finding one because so many of them just screwed things up really badly. So the right way to do alt text is to pass on any content-like information that visual users are getting that the visually impaired user would not be getting. So for example, on this site, it's the Calgary Public Library, and they have a page about their book truck. And the actual alt text they have here for this picture of the book truck is the words book truck, which seems straightforward while you're just describing what it is, right? But no, that's not actually useful information to a user in a screen reader. They can tell by what page they're on. They know the page is about a book truck. You don't need to tell them that they're missing an image of a book truck. But there is information there that they should get. When you think about it, it's like, what does the user need to know about that picture? So how would you describe the van, and which parts of that are important? Well, it's really probably not important to them that the van is white, but it is important to them that it is a van. Because if you hear the words book truck, you're like, well, book truck, is that a semi-sized truck? Is it a pickup truck-sized truck? You're kind of wondering what it is. So by having alt text that's something like a large van with the words book truck written on the side, the user is going to be like, oh, it's the size of a large van, and that'll help them put it into context. So if they're ever out and they want to go to the book truck, they know what to expect. You know, you're going to be expecting different things if it's a van as opposed to a semi-sized truck as opposed to a pickup truck. So that's information that's available to the visual user, but not to the screen reader user, so that should go in your alt text. Anything that's like a decoration should not. Like the logo, it says Calgary Public Library, and then there's a snowflake. A visually impaired user does not need to know a snowflake every time they go to this page. That's not adding anything to the information for them. Here's another example. And this is a site from a museum about a program that they have for children. And the actual description of the program is only a paragraph or two. It doesn't really describe much. But the image really gives a lot more information about what the program is about. It's a picture of two kids, and they're looking through a box of rocks to find fossils, and they're using a magnifying glass. So if you're a visual user, you go to this, you're like, oh, I can look at this picture, and now I understand what my kids will be doing if they're in this program, or at least one example of something they'll be doing. So that's information that a screen reader user should know, what the kids are doing in the picture, because that'll help them understand the program better. As opposed to this on the same site, this is a page about teacher resources. The picture, all that's in there is a couple binders and that are actually their teacher resources. So describing that picture wouldn't add anything for the user, because those probably aren't even the actual teacher resources. They're just something that they mocked up because they needed a photo to put in that slot in the template. So here, I wouldn't put any alt text in at all because you're not giving them any useful information. If you're not providing alt text for a user, you have to still put the alt, and then you do equals, and then quotation marks with nothing between the quotation marks, not even a space. The screen reader will see that and skip over it. If you just leave alt text out altogether, it will read the name of the file, which is something that's not going to be useful. So don't make the user listen to the name of the file. Make sure you put that blank alt text in there. Next, for screen reader users, and really for any user, is ensure that your link text is descriptive. Here we just have click here, click here, click here, which is annoying for a visual user because you're trying to skim through the page and look for the right link. But for screen reader users, it's even more annoying because one of the ways they use a screen reader is they can ask it to read all the links on the page to them so they can pick the one they want. So if they're asking their screen reader to read the links on this page, they're just going to hear click here, click here, click here, and they won't know which is which. So it makes the page almost totally useless to them. So the link should be an accurate and not too long description of what they'll get if they click on it. Next tip, don't rely on color on your website. So 4.5% of the population is colorblind, and that's mostly males. Color blindness, it's not really a blindness to color, it's just that people see colors differently. So on the top you see what a normal person without color blindness would see when they look at a rainbow. And on the bottom, people with 3 different times of color blindness would see 3 different things looking at that exact same rainbow. So you can see that they really see something different for some of the colors. As an example, the most common color blindness is red and green. And I like using this picture as an example because you look at it, you see a lot of reds and greens and oranges and yellows. If you're colorblind, this is what you would see. So you see really only yellows and different shades of green, and it's a lot harder to tell things apart. This is another type of color blindness. So where this comes in on the web is any place where you might use color to convey information. This is something I found on Wikipedia, and they're trying to show which counties voted for a certain referendum and which counties didn't vote for it. The colors red and green are kind of unfortunate choice because if you're colorblind, that's what you see, all the same color. So don't do this. And there's ways that you can figure out whether or not your colors are okay for color blindness. But you also want to look at it and see if there's other ways you can convey information without color at all. For example, you could have a different pattern on the different states. You can still use color, that's fine, just don't use that as the only thing to convey information. Another thing to think about, kind of on the same topic, is people that are printing web pages, because you kind of get the same thing. They're not getting any of the color if they're using a black and white printer like this one. So here we have a map that uses different colors, blue, green, red. When you look at the map in black and white, you can still tell the things apart because they used other things, like making the lines different widths and using different darknesses in the colors. So you can still see which is the land and which is the water and which are major roads. So that's a good example of making sure that color isn't the only thing that conveys meaning on the page. To test how your website will look for colorblind people, there's a whole bunch of tools online like this one. You just put in your URL or upload a file, and it'll show you how it would look on the different types of color blindness. Next tip is make sure there's enough contrast. Can you see on the bottom left where they have the address? Can anybody see that? No, you can't, because it's in dark gray text on a black background. Like on the computer, if I really squint at it really close, I can see it, but that's about it. So this is bad, obviously. But even if something looks to you like there's enough contrast, you might not be able to tell because you need to remember that not everybody has the same quality vision that you do. They actually made up a standard of how much contrast should be between foreground and background text. There's a ratio, and it's slightly different depending on how large the text is. Here's an example. The light gray text on the bottom doesn't have enough contrast, so it fails the test, where the dark gray text on the top passes. A bunch of sites online that you can use to check the contrast between colors. Just enter the foreground and background colors in hex or RGB, and it'll tell you if it passes or not. So if it's not otherwise obvious, I would suggest checking this all the time because it's really simple to do, and it'll make sure that this part of your website is still usable for as many people as possible. You also want to think about people who are using their phones outside. The bright sunlight washes everything out and makes it hard to see what's on the screen. So you need more contrast when you're outside in bright sunlight to be able to see easily. So I suggest, if you can, to test your site actually outside in bright sunlight. Just take your phone outside and do testing there. Because what you see when you're in the office, even if you're using a bunch of different devices, you're in the office under fluorescent lights and you're not going to see the same thing as somebody sees outside. So give this a try. You might discover you need to add more contrast so your site is usable for people that are in bright sunlight. Contrast is also a problem when you put text on top of an image. Here, there's not enough contrast. There's just also a lot of busyness, and it's hard to read the text. You can get around this by using text shadow or a gradient background or something like that, and try different things out. And it's still possible to put the text there, but use different levels of color and darkness to make sure that it's easy to read. You also want to add captions to videos. So this is for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. YouTube actually does automatic captions now, if it can understand what's being said. And you can go back in and edit them if they're not correct. And this is a really great free way to make sure that there's captions on your videos. If you do it yourself, it's actually very difficult and time-consuming, so if you can find an automatic service, that's really great. This doesn't only help people who are deaf, it also helps people that are, say, at work and they don't have headphones and they want to watch a video but they can't turn on the sound, something like that. So a lot of different things we do for accessibility don't just help people with disabilities, they help other people who don't have disabilities. And those are only a few things with accessibility, so try to find an accessibility checklist online, this one or another one. Get familiar with it and learn about some of the other things you need to do. And then go through the checklist every time you make a website to make sure that you're actually doing all the things on the list and making your site as accessible as possible. Moving on from accessibility, forms are always a big problem on websites because they are one of the things that people interact with the most, but it's so easy to screw them up and make it difficult for people to interact with them. The best forms are the simplest forms, because that makes it easier for the user, obviously. So on this, you only need to put in your email address to sign up for an email list. As opposed to this one, you have to enter your name, and they're also trying to get you to enter your city, province, and postal code. It's not necessary to have this information to send you an email. They just want it for marketing or whatever their reason. But by having all these extra fields, you're probably dissuading some people from signing up for the list, especially if there's fields that they really don't want to fill out. Like they don't want to give you their name, they might just put in a fake name or something like that, or skip it entirely. The more fields to fill out, especially is a problem on mobile because it's so much harder to enter things in a form when you're using the tiny little keyboard. What might be easy typing on a keyboard on your desktop is going to be a lot harder on that touch screen. On forms, make sure you use the appropriate input types. And this is something that's new in HTML5 if you're not familiar with it, is you can set the type on different text inputs and it'll change what the user sees when they try to enter something in that field. So for example, by entering the type of email, you actually get a different keyboard when you're on a mobile device. You get the @ symbol on the main screen, so you don't have to go to the secondary screen to get the @ symbol. So it's a little thing, but that saves the user a bit of time as they're filling out a form. There's other email types like URL where you get the / and the colon on the main keyboard. And also something like a date where on the mobile you'd get little scrollers for the month and day and year instead of having to type it out. So this is something that you as developers will have to know how to do because your designer might not even know this is possible and think to put it in the design. Always include instructions when needed on the form if it is going to make a difference in what the users fill out. Here I'm signing up. It tells me to enter my email address and choose a password. I do that and hit submit, and now it's telling me that I didn't enter enough characters. Why didn't it tell me the rules first before I filled out the form? It wouldn't have taken any effort to put the rule on the first page before I filled it out. Always show which fields are required in a form so a user doesn't submit and then find out that they didn't fill in what they're supposed to. The common way to do this is with an asterisk. I always put an explanation at the top that says what that means. Say that the asterisk means that these fields are required. You'd think everybody would know this by now, but they've actually done studies and found out there's a small percentage of people who don't know this. So they're just going to see these asterisks and not know what they mean unless you tell them. Another way to do it is just put the word required, which is really straightforward and you don't have to further explain it. If most of the fields are required, just say so and then use the word optional to mark the fields that aren't required. You also want to provide helpful error messages. This is a really good example. They put the error message right next to each field instead of all at the top of the page. Specific message telling you exactly what you did wrong so you can fix it. And it's very visible so you don't have to scroll through the page looking for what it is that you need to fix. This is an example of microcontent that we talked about a little bit ago. You want to make sure these error messages are really straightforward and clear so the users do know what they need to do. Moving on, we need to think about speed. People are impatient. They don't want to wait for your site to load. So you want to do everything you can to make it faster. So when we're creating a site, we're usually sitting in an office or at our home computer. We're on broadband. It's really fast. But users might be on a mobile phone, slow cellular network. They might be in a hotel or a coffee shop where there's really slow Wi-Fi. You really don't know. And then there's dial-up. You thought this went away a long time ago, didn't you? No, turns out 18% of Canadians live in areas that don't have access to high-speed broadband. Not all of those are on dial-up. Some of them are on other types of internet, but it's not high-speed. But there are still people that use dial-up. This is especially a problem in rural areas, especially in northern Canada, and it means that a lot of Native people are affected by this because there's more of them in the northern areas of Canada and rural areas. So by not thinking about speed, it's directly impacting the specific community of people. There's even people who live in cities that use dial-up because it's cheaper than broadband, which for us, it doesn't seem like a lot of money to have high-speed internet at home, but for some people, they just can't do it, so they still have the dial-up. And when it takes them 8 minutes to download your web page, that's really, really bad. So make it as fast as possible. Obviously, not everything can be super speedy, even if you have dial-up, but do the best that you can to make it as fast as possible for everybody. When you're thinking about speed, there's a bunch of different things that affect performance. This is an example of average websites, how many megabytes are downloaded for particular things. 63% of the average website is images, which I'm going to talk about in a second. 16% is scripts, and this refers to all the sites where they have all of jQuery, even though they're only using one tiny bit of it. You don't need to have tons of libraries if you're not using the whole thing. Just figure out what you can cut out. Just write JavaScript yourself, rather than using the entire library if you don't need the whole thing. 10% is videos. Make sure your videos don't autoplay or auto-download because users might not have the bandwidth to do that. So for images, we want to use responsive images as much as possible. And this means that we're sending different sizes of images to different devices. So if you're on a phone with a screen like this, you don't want to send an image that's this big because you don't need an image that big, and it's going to be taking a long time to download. So for that small screen, you want to send a small image. Then for the large screen, send a large image. If you're using a content management system, there's plugins that will do this. You don't need to do it manually necessarily, but if you're actually coding a website, you may need to write the code for this, and you can find lots of articles online that'll explain how to do this if you don't know. You want to test your site's performance to see how you're doing. There's a lot of free sites where you can do this. This is Google PageSpeed Insights. So when I put in my own site, I actually didn't do that great. It told me I only get 72% in mobile, but I'm good in desktop. And it tells me specifically what things I can fix to make it faster, so it's very helpful. A lot of other sites will kind of do the same thing, but give you different types of information. This seems obvious, but when you have a site, you want to make sure nothing is broken. I mean, there's a lot of times you'll go to websites and their form won't submit, or there'll be broken links all over the place. And those are things that are really easy to check for, and sometimes we just don't bother to check. So you should look for broken links. Check all the forms. Make sure pages look the way they're supposed to no matter what device you're on. And don't just do this once when a site launches, but do it periodically to make sure that things didn't change, especially broken links. Links that work now, some of them will be broken by the time you come back in a few weeks or in a few months or whatever. So always go back and check for broken links. You want to test your site on different devices and browsers. You should have a bunch of them in your office that you can test on as you're developing and when the site is ready. You should at least have iOS and Android. Try to get different sizes of screens. If you work at a company that has a big budget, try to get a whole device lab with more obscure phones, with older phones, because older phones might not display things in the same ways. You're probably going to have a list of devices that you actually support in your design, but you should test on other ones too to make sure that your site is at least functional, even if it doesn't look the way it's supposed to look. If you don't have access to a lot of different devices, there's emulators and simulators online that you can use it doesn't work as good as testing on the device because you don't get the full experience, but at least you're doing something. This is an example of one. They have a free trial so you can try it out, or just, I think they have a monthly fee if you want to pay for it. You just enter your URL, choose which devices you want to test on, and then it shows you a screenshot of each one. You also want to test on screen readers. There are screen readers you can get for free. Some of them are more expensive. If you don't have the time or ability to actually test on a real screen reader, this is a plugin for Firefox that shows in text what a screen reader user will hear. So it will say, it tells the user this is a link or this is a heading or whatever, so you can actually see that in the text. It's not just the text that's on the page. And you can also see on the different tabs here the list of links or the list of headings, which are two ways that screen reader users will navigate through a site. If you have a Mac or an iOS device, they actually have built-in VoiceOver, which can read everything out loud, so that's a nice tool you can use too. So that was a lot of information, but I need to let you know that it's really only the beginning. There's a whole lot to user experience, more than I can cover in 45 minutes, but at least now you have a place to start. So hopefully, if you can implement some of these tips, you've made your website at least a little bit better for your users. Thank you.